Narcissistic grandiosity has always existed, also in the form of nationalism and racism, as the greatness of the many who look down on everyone else with contempt. And yet, the need to experience oneself as great seems to have gained an importance in recent decades, as shown above all by right-wing populist movements, which are usually based on an underlying narcissistic logic. The current use of the term narcissism tends to label everything that has to do with a relationship to oneself with the term narcissism. Not so Erich Fromm. For Fromm, every person must also be related to himself and herself, which has nothing to do with narcissism, but with self-love and self-interest. For Fromm, narcissism is always a pathological way of being related, which has clear characteristics. It is typical for all forms of narcissism that being related to oneself, to others, to reality, that this being related is distorted, always idealizing on the one hand and devaluing on the other hand. That one's own negative aspects, such as weaknesses, faults, fears, doubts, are not only repressed, but denied. And that the denied aspects are projected onto others, so that narcissism is always accompanied by the need for bogeyman. That there is a splitting of reality, but also of thinking and feeling, where there is only good and evil, and only an either or, and all mixtures, ambivalences, and intermediate tones are missing. That all attention and appreciation are only for one's own aggrandizement, while others are meaningless. Others will only be noticed if they mirror or enhance one's own greatness. That they are vulnerable when they fail at something or when their greatness is questioned by others. And that they react to criticism with aggression and fierce anger, and are incapable of any self-criticism. Social character formation always have to do with social developments. How does the narcissistic social character formation start in many people? At least a few hints should be made here. First of all, there is a persistent degradation that many people experience as such. Social, professional, political, or financial degradations, disadvantages, and exclusions that undermine self-esteem. And directly visible is also a culture of narcissism. To be economically successful, you have to be the biggest and the best, eliminate the competition, and make yourself the market leader. In the culture sector too, it's all about grandeur, from the University of Excellence to the bestseller list to the popularity rankings, and so on. By discussing the marketing orientation, we have seen that the marketing orientation permanently weakens the experience of self-esteem because it relies on the ego of the market instead of the practice of one's own powers, which is the basis of self-esteem. The use of digital technology and electronic media, which are very helpful in practice, also implies a most unconscious devaluation of the user. The marvels of technology calculate, compute, remember better, and know much more than humans could ever do with their brains. Whether experienced consciously or insidiously or unconsciously, the self-esteem of many people is becoming increasingly fragile. A narcissistic character formation is an attempt at compensating for the deficit permanently. This brings us to the question of the psychodynamics of the narcissistic social character. Neuronal development allows humans to relate to reality not only with their senses, but also fictitiously, that is, only imagined. The narcissist uses this possibility. He fantasizes that he or she is more grandiose than he or she is in reality, and at the same time rejects everything that speaks against the fantasized grandiosity. Short-lived events in daydreams become a permanent, pathological pattern of relatedness in narcissistic character formation. In this formation, similar to the authoritarian character, two manifestations can be distinguished, an active and a passive one. The actively narcissistic character idealizes him or herself or certain aspects of his or her own self, at the same time devaluing everything that does not fit this grandiose self by projecting what is devalued onto others in order to actively keep it away from him or herself. The most striking psychological deficit of the narcissist is his lack of interest in other persons, in all otherness, in all strangeness, in all what is non-self. Unless he or she can identify others as aspects of his or her own person. This fundamental disinterest is accompanied by resentment and hostility to the extent that he or she feels compelled to keep what is projected onto others away from him or herself. Most narcissistic character formations are not based on an active idealization of oneself, but on identifying with a narcissistic person, organization, or idea in order to passively share in its grandiosity, that is, to feel grandiose about belonging. Fromm has described this passive form as group narcissism. This allows society's losers and failures to experience themselves as great. For example, in right-wing populist movements or as fans of football clubs and so on. Now, group narcissism has only its own superiority and grandiosity in mind. It presents itself politically as the voice of the people, but is in reality anti-democratic. What is the real meaning of populism? you listen. It does not know true social, cultural, political, religious tolerance and acceptance of what is not one's own. Instead of togetherness, group narcissism propagates antagonism. Here too, let us ask more precisely which strivings and values are demanded in society and to be encouraged, and which are to be repressed where possible, in order to identify the objectives for transformation. Speaking about oneself and one's own achievements, one's own company, one's own group, one's own organization, only in superlatives. The best, the greatest, the unique, the excellent. And being full of self-competence and talk only about great things that we have to live and to think, keeping everything that is difficult, conflictual, doubtful at bay, simply ignoring it, delegating or projecting it to others, nipping any criticism and questioning in the bud, and instead creating bogeymen and attacking the competition. We have to live and to think demonstrating superiority, because being the best, one is not dependent on anyone and has no one to fear. And at the same time, demonizing everything foreign and not own, and want to eliminate it from the world. In order to find out what impedes the biophilic growth tendency in the narcissistic character, attention has to be directed to what is being repressed. Any kind of physical, mental, or psychological limitation, weakness, or inability, and everything that could be perceived as imperfect, as defective, mediocre, insufficient, has to be covered up from oneself and others, often even denied and projected onto others. This is especially true with regard to negative self-perceptions, which have to be repressed, such as feelings of fear, of guilt and shame. They have to be systematically hidden or covered up by mainly aggressive expressions. Especially noticeable is the repression of everything that would express being dependent on others. To ask, to thank, to appreciate others, to need something from others. All this is not possible, is repressed. Those who live with an idealized idea of themselves and use others as self-object, aspects of their own self. For them, experiences of being left, of being written off, and of becoming insignificant for the public are the worst case in life, with often tragic consequences. The consequences of repression in the case of the narcissistic character and group character are obvious. The positive interest in the other person and in strangers is lost because they are made the holders of the negative aspects of the self that are denied in oneself. From a psychodynamic perspective, effective changes are possible only if the devaluation dynamics that lead to self-idealization are recognized and eliminated. And at the same time, the experience of self-esteem is drawn from the, albeit mediocre, self-efficiency of own mental powers.